missiles, silence, and the end of illusions. For decades, Europe believed that the Cold War was over, borders were fixed, nuclear weapons were distant, and the idea that strategic missiles could once again be quietly moved closer to European capitals belonged to history books. That illusion is ending. In early 2026, Ukrainian intelligence revealed that Russia is preparing to deploy a new class of nuclear-capable ballistic missiles, not inside Russia, but in Belarus. Missiles designed to shorten warning times, compress decision-making, and force Europe to confront a threat it hoped would never return. Officially, this deployment is described as deterrence, a defensive measure, a sovereign choice made by Minsk. In reality, it tells a far more troubling story. A story of a country losing control over its own territory, of nuclear weapons without national command, of a silent conquest carried out not with tanks, but with infrastructure, integration, and fear. This is not just about Belarus. It is about how Vladimir Putin uses nuclear proximity to pressure NATO, intimidate Europe, and reshape the rules of negotiation, while avoiding direct confrontation. And it is about how Europe is responding. Because this time, the threats are not pushing Europe apart. They may be pulling it together. This is the story of the Oreshnik missile, of Belarus's fading sovereignty, and of a continent once again forced to measure peace in minutes. In early 2026, Ukrainian intelligence quietly released an assessment that sent shockwaves through European security circles. According to Kyiv, Russia was preparing to deploy a new category of ballistic missile on the territory of Belarus, the Oreshnik system. At first glance, the announcement sounded familiar. Another missile, another threat, another warning from the intelligence war surrounding Ukraine. But beneath the surface, this development represented something far more serious, a deliberate shift in Russia's nuclear posture on Europe's doorstep. The Oreshnik missile is not a conventional battlefield weapon. It belongs to a class of intermediate-range ballistic missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads. Its value lies not in its explosive power alone, but in what it changes strategically: distance, reaction time, and decision-making under pressure. According to Ukrainian intelligence, construction is already underway in Belarus. Launch infrastructure, command and control systems, surveillance assets, and secure communications are being installed. The system is not yet fully operational, but it does not need to be. The signal has already been sent. Russia is moving its most sensitive weapons closer to European capitals. From Belarusian territory, Oreshnik missiles would dramatically reduce warning times for targets across Central and Western Europe. Cities such as Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, and potentially even Paris would fall within a compressed strike window measured in minutes rather than tens of minutes. In nuclear strategy, minutes matter. The shorter the warning time, the greater the pressure on decision-makers. Detection, verification, consultation, and response all collapse into a dangerously narrow timeframe. This increases the risk of miscalculation, exactly the kind of instability nuclear doctrine is supposed to avoid. This is not accidental. The deployment of Oreshnik fits a pattern that has defined Russian strategy since the invasion of Ukraine: controlled escalation without immediate detonation. Moscow repeatedly pushes the boundary, not to cross it outright, but to force its adversaries to recalibrate. The Kremlin understands that nuclear weapons do not need to be fired to be effective. Their mere positioning alters behavior. For Belarus, the situation is even more precarious. President Alexander Lukashenko has publicly framed the deployment as a defensive measure, a shield to protect Belarus from NATO aggression. Official statements emphasize deterrence, sovereignty, and partnership with Russia. But Ukrainian intelligence and Western analysts tell a different story. Belarus will not control these weapons. The Oreshnik missiles, once deployed, will remain under the direct command of Russia's strategic forces. Launch authority, targeting decisions, and operational control will reside in Moscow, not Minsk. Belarusian territory becomes a hosting platform, not a sovereign actor. In practical terms, this turns Belarus into a forward operating base for Russian nuclear strategy. This arrangement mirrors previous deployments of Russian tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus, but Oreshnik represents a qualitative escalation. Intermediate-range systems bridge the gap between battlefield nuclear weapons and intercontinental missiles. They are designed for regional coercion, precisely the kind of leverage Russia seeks over Europe. The timing is also telling. Russia is under sustained pressure on multiple fronts, militarily bogged down in Ukraine, economically constrained by sanctions, politically isolated in much of the Western world. Under these conditions, Moscow turns to its most reliable instrument of influence, strategic fear. By placing nuclear-capable missiles in Belarus, Russia externalizes its pressure. It shifts the conversation away from Ukrainian territory and toward European vulnerability. The battlefield becomes psychological as much as physical. Ukrainian intelligence views this move as an attempt to redraw the escalation ladder. Instead of responding to Ukrainian actions on the front lines, Russia threatens Europe directly. The implicit message is clear. Continued support for Ukraine carries existential risks. But there is another layer. The Oreshnik deployment also serves as a test, not of hardware, but of resolve. Moscow is probing how Europe and NATO react when nuclear proximity increases without a shot being fired. Will there be restraint, dialogue, concessions, or will deterrence harden? For decades, European security architecture rested on distance. The Cold War placed nuclear weapons far away, behind layers of buffers and treaties. Oreshnik erodes that buffer. It brings strategic weapons into the heart of Eastern Europe under the cover of alliance and consent, at least on paper, because Belarus's consent is increasingly questionable. Lukashenko's regime depends almost entirely on Moscow for survival. Since the 2020 protests, Belarus has lost meaningful political autonomy. Economic integration, military coordination, intelligence sharing, all have deepened to the point where analysts now describe Belarus not as an ally, but as an extension of Russian strategic depth. The Oreshnik deployment formalizes that reality. It turns silent dependence into visible subordination, and it places Belarus squarely in the line of fire in any future confrontation between Russia and NATO. Whether Minsk wants it or not, its territory becomes a priority target in strategic planning. This is the paradox of nuclear protection. The weapons meant to deter aggression also guarantee attention and vulnerability. Ukraine understands this dynamic intimately. That is why Kyiv chose to reveal the Oreshnik preparations early, not to provoke panic, but to shape the narrative before Moscow could frame the deployment as routine or benign. By exposing the infrastructure phase, Ukrainian intelligence signals that escalation is deliberate, planned, and reversible, if pressure is applied early enough. The message to Europe is implicit but urgent. This is not about Belarusian defense. It is about Russian leverage. Oreshnik is not aimed at Kyiv. It is aimed at Brussels, Berlin, Paris, and at the political will that sustains Ukraine's resistance. On paper, Belarus remains an independent state. It has a flag, a government, a seat at the United Nations, and a president who speaks in the language of sovereignty and national defense. But in practice, Belarus has crossed a threshold that is far more difficult to reverse. The planned deployment of Russian Oreshnik missiles does not simply change the military balance in Eastern Europe. It exposes a political reality that has been forming for years. Belarus no longer controls its own strategic destiny. President Alexander Lukashenko insists otherwise. In public statements, he frames the Russian military presence as a voluntary alliance, a partnership designed to deter NATO and protect Belarusian territory from external threats. According to this narrative, hosting Russian weapons strengthens Belarusian security, but deterrence only works if the host nation holds the keys. Belarus does not. Ukrainian intelligence and Western analysts agree on a critical point. Any nuclear-capable missiles deployed on Belarusian soil will remain under the direct command of Russia's strategic forces. Minsk will not control launch authority. It will not determine targeting. It will not decide escalation or restraint. Belarus provides the land. Moscow provides the finger on the trigger. This distinction matters because sovereignty is not defined by borders alone. It is defined by who makes the ultimate decisions when survival is at stake. By that standard, Belarus's sovereignty has already been hollowed out. This process did not begin with the war in Ukraine. Belarus has been drifting into Russia's strategic orbit for decades. Economic dependency deepened through energy subsidies, preferential trade, and financial bailouts. Military integration followed with joint exercises, shared command structures, and Russian access to Belarusian bases. Intelligence cooperation blurred the line between coordination and control. The turning point came in 2020. After mass protests threatened Lukashenko's grip on power, Moscow intervened, not with tanks, but with guarantees, political backing, security support, economic lifelines. In exchange, Lukashenko surrendered what remained of Belarus's strategic autonomy. From that moment on, Belarus's survival became inseparable from the Kremlin's interests. The war in Ukraine accelerated this transformation. Belarusian territory was used as a staging ground for the initial invasion. Russian troops moved freely. Missiles were launched from Belarusian soil. Infrastructure was repurposed without meaningful public debate or parliamentary oversight. Each step normalized the idea that Belarusian territory could be used for Russian wars. The Oreshnik deployment takes this normalization to its logical conclusion. It embeds Russian nuclear strategy directly into the Belarusian landscape. Analysts increasingly describe this process as a silent conquest. There is no formal annexation, no referendums, no declarations of union. Instead, sovereignty erodes through integration so deep that separation becomes impractical. Belarus is not occupied. It is absorbed. Lukashenko's role in this system is paradoxical. He presents himself as the guardian of Belarusian independence, yet his political survival depends entirely on Moscow's protection. This dependency strips him of leverage. When Russia demands military access, the answer is predetermined. Publicly, Lukashenko claims the deployment of Russian missiles enhances Belarus's deterrence. Privately, he has little choice, and the Belarusian population has even less. There is no national debate about nuclear hosting, no referendum, no parliamentary approval with genuine opposition. Decisions of existential importance are made behind closed doors, communicated as fate's accomplice. This is not alliance politics. It is vassalage. The consequences are severe. By hosting Russian strategic weapons, Belarus automatically becomes a priority target in any NATO contingency planning. Even if Belarus never fires a shot, its territory becomes militarized in the eyes of potential adversaries. Security decreases as protection increases. This paradox is not new in history. Small states aligned with nuclear powers often trade autonomy for guarantees, only to discover that those guarantees come with existential risk. Belarus is now living that reality. There is also a regional impact. Neighboring countries, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, must now plan for a nuclear-armed Belarus that does not control its own arsenal. This erodes trust, increases militarization, and hardens borders. Ironically, the very deployment Lukashenko claims is defensive contributes to regional instability. From Moscow's perspective, this is efficient. Belarus offers strategic depth without political resistance. Russian forces operate with fewer constraints. NATO's eastern flank becomes more complex and more fragile. The cost is borne by Belarus itself, a country that once positioned itself as a neutral buffer between East and West has become a forward platform for Russian power projection. Its diplomatic options shrink, its room for maneuver disappears, and reversing this trajectory becomes increasingly difficult. Once strategic weapons are embedded, infrastructure built, and command systems integrated, sovereignty is no longer a switch that can be flipped back on. It requires systemic rupture, political, economic, and security upheaval. For now, Belarus remains quiet. But silence is not stability. It is the sound of a country whose most important decisions are being made elsewhere.